When the early 20th century theologian Paul Tillich wrote in his Systematic Theology that God does not exist, he created a firestorm in the media and among modern churches. But Tillich was not actually declaring himself to be an atheist. It wasn't that he didn't believe in God, but he specifically did not believe in a supernatural theistic God who existed, which means in time and in a particular place. God is not somewhere. In fact, God is not someone. I found it to be helpful to focus on his insistence that in order to understand the bigger God, you first have to be willing to kill off the little God who's standing in your way. God, as conceived in antiquity, was a person, an individual who had human-like qualities like emotions, but also had supernatural powers like immortality and invisibility. The primitive conceptions of God, along with the complementary angels, demons, heaven, hell, occupy so much space in culture that it's difficult to see beyond it. It's difficult to get a word in edgewise. If you are religious, you are expected to be religious in terms of the prevailing culture. If you're religious in India, you probably are a Hindu. If you're religious in Iran, you're probably a Muslim. If you're religious in Northern Ireland, you better be a Catholic. These rigid constructs, I would argue, tend to extinguish sincere thought and, at the same time, any sincere spirituality. If I am to be a person of faith here in the Midwest, I almost certainly have to be some flavor of Christian, and I have to be that with fairly irrational beliefs in the primacy of the Bible, the eternal presence of Jesus, and to live in a certain anticipation of an extraordinarily hazardous final judgment. But through the centuries, we have examples of people who have refused to just fit into that narrow box. But it's often been quite dangerous to be public about it. Even in ancient Greece, the birthplace of Western civilization, philosophy, and literature, many politicians, and probably most philosophers, didn't buy into the myths about all of the gods. But they had to be careful or they would be charged with being godless or an atheist, and that could turn the entire public against you. In the 5th century before the Common Era, some 2,600 years ago, the Greek philosopher Euripides wrote these lines for a character in a play. He didn't write as if it were him speaking, but he wrote plays in which one character says, "Doth someone say, there be gods above? There are not. No, there are not. Let no one fool you. Do not be led by the old false fable, and thus be deceived." Early Greek philosophers often wrote in the forms of dialogues and plays because that way you could put their ideas into the mouths of a fictional character without having to say these things themselves and then suffer the consequences. You should be cautious about writers even today. If you interrupt them, they can put you into a book and kill you. Still, history and literature are littered with examples of people who just refuse to be religious in a formal way because the claims of those rigid religious systems were based on very primitive and anthropomorphic views of the divine. And when you're given a choice between either believing in this certain way or being a godless heathen, for many, heathen doesn't look like that bad of an option. In another play, Euripides suggests that someone who was very clever invented God in order to frighten people into living a moral life. That observation has echoed through the centuries because fear of divine judgment has been both useful to governments and to religions. As our good friend Bishop John Shelby Spong has said, the church invented hell in order to keep you making donations. It is a way of controlling you. I'd like to think that most of us would like to be peaceful, considerate, compassionate, good people because it's just better to be good than to be violent, dishonest, self-serving, or criminal. But you have to admit, religion has been a needed incentive to get people to even act like they're good when you couldn't rely on the inherent good instincts of people in general. The 18th century French philosopher Voltaire famously observed that if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. Voltaire obviously was an atheist, but he very wryly noted the social usefulness of a watchful and harshly judgmental God who could serve to keep society from falling into anarchy. Where fear of the police is not enough to control people's more base instincts, we insert a fear of God. Tuesday evening, David and I are hosting an online conference on Zoom entitled Overcoming Religious Guilt and Fear. You'll find that link at the top of our Emerging Church Facebook page if you cannot copy it from the text of the sermon that appears on our website, or this image you see on your screen now, which is way too many letters for you to pause and copy. We discovered in the course of offering another online conference a couple of months ago that most of the people who attended were not interested in discussing the topic that we had been assigned. They were, however, interested in describing their own sense of having been traumatized either by religious leaders or by the institution of religion itself in their childhood. While, as Voltaire and Euripides noted that religion is used to frighten and manipulate people into behaving better, and it's kind of useful that way, there are very many ways in which the plunge into that irrational way of thinking has also led people into doing even worse things than we were trying to scare them into stopping. Obviously, especially for those of us who grew up in predominantly Christian culture, there's been a lot of judgment about being a homosexual or being trans. Women have almost always been relegated to a second-class citizenship through religious insistence. And we've all heard nauseating accounts of the sexual exploitation of children under the auspices of religious authority. The media has talked primarily about pedophilia among Catholic priests, but I assure you that it's not limited to the Roman Catholics. In my own practice of pastoral counseling, I've talked with many people who were sexually exploited by ministers and church leaders in the Southern Baptist Church, in the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Methodists, the Assemblies of God, and in my own mother church, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Among the disciples, the controversy went right up to the top, hiding a 40-year-long career of child abuse by a man who ended his career as the general minister and president of the whole denomination, C. William Nichols, who went to his grave in 2012 while still avoiding any legal consequences for an absolutely monstrous life of sexual abuse of vulnerable victims, always protected by church authorities. But while all of these examples are horrible and they make for great movie plots and newspaper headlines, what I want to focus on in our conference on Tuesday evening is not these specific crimes and these particular criminals, but more I'd like to talk about the big lie, the lie that has been perpetuated for centuries, a lie that makes children believe that touching their private parts might make them spend eternity in a burning hell, and telling them that century after century, and literally telling billions of children that if they act in ways that humans cannot not act, that they will be subject to eternal torture. That, men and women, I submit, is child abuse. I don't want to spend a lot of time defining venial sins versus mortal sins, but if you would just allow me this one thought. What is putting a child in a cage at the border for 2 months compared to having a trusted Sunday school teacher telling hundreds of little children Sunday after Sunday that they are very likely to go to hell forever if they behave in ways that they cannot help behaving? I don't know who started the internet memes that suggest that we probably should have always been more afraid of the righteous who burned witches alive than we were of the witchcraft that we were setting out to burn. I took for our wisdom lesson today a piece from the writings of the 18th century French Enlightenment, a movement that in many ways gave birth to desires for liberty, equality, and freedom that found physical expression in the founding of the United States. Baron de Holbach. In the days before television, movies, and the internet, people like Baron de Holbach would keep what was called a salon, a meeting room where people would come to entertain one another with intelligent conversation. A lot of publications arose from these public sharing of ideas, much as had been done in the open-air meetings of philosophers in ancient Greece. They also got a lot of people into a lot of trouble for allowing them to speak out loud and to think about how the claims of the Catholic Church were completely absurd and that religious guilt and fear had no place in the modern world. The Catholic Church fought hard to close these salons and to suppress the publications that came out of them, even to the point of threatening the government of France that they would encourage their parishioners not to pay their taxes if they allowed it to continue to go on. There was a time in France when simply owning a copy of one of Voltaire's books could get you executed in Paris. But I found this quote because it had such an impact on the thinking of the British poet Percy Shelley, who was a great thinker, also married to the woman who wrote Frankenstein. And I guess she got to be more famous than him. But he quoted Baron de Holbach in an anonymous pamphlet about the necessity of atheism that he published when he was a first-year student at Oxford. He didn't sign it, but he had friends that ratted him out, and he was called in and asked to either deny that he had written it or face expulsion. The term in French is, I think, sent to the country. You're literally forced out of the university into the countryside to think about how wrong you were for being an atheist. But Shelley's willingness to ask hard questions made him accept his expulsion, and his writings did later influence people like Karl Marx and Gandhi. My point today is that there are very many good reasons to strive to be a spiritual person, a good person, a compassionate person. But I'm afraid that institutional religion gets in the way of that goal, both through filling our minds with magic and superstition and giving us very good reasons to try to find a therapist to help us to overcome the poison that religion leaves behind even years after you've stopped going to church. De Holbach, line by line, knocks the foundations out from under traditional Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox Christianity by just saying the obvious. If God is infinitely good, then what reason do we have to fear him? If God is infinitely wise, why should we have doubts concerning our future? If God knows all, why do we fatigue him with our constant prayers? If he is everywhere, why do we build temples? If God is just, why fear that God will punish the creatures that God himself filled with weaknesses? If God is all-powerful, how could we offend him? Or how could we resist him? If God is reasonable, how can he be angry at the blind to whom he has given the liberty of being unreasonable? If God is immovable, by what right do we pretend to change him in prayerful decrees? If God is inconceivable, why do we keep thinking about him? If God has spoken, how could the universe not be convinced? The revolutionaries of the French Enlightenment and then the American freedom movement that followed were not being simply satisfied with individual enlightenment and the rejection of the mental prison that religion imposed. They wanted society itself to be free. They wanted to be liberators through their philosophy. I left grad school in the mid-1980s with a skull full of theology and not enough smarts to make it fit together. I credit the insightful works of the famous M. Scott Peck, the famous psychiatrist, with making my formal education actually useful to me. In his book, The Different Drum, Peck describes 4 stages of spiritual transformation, beginning with the chaos of early childhood, full of selfishness and fear and greed and an apparent willingness, or Peck suggests an inability to care for others. Sadly, this is not just an affliction of childhood, since many people persist in exactly this state for their entire lives. Without being at all tongue-in-cheek about it, this is the kind of person we saw in our former President Donald Trump, and in the kind of people who tried to overthrow our democracy on January 6th. They stormed the Capitol building as if they were brave and courageous conquerors, but they were motivated by fear, without anything governing their morals. This is a stage one mentality that persists in at least a third of society for a lifetime. Most people, however, are trained out of this stage with what Peck calls an institutional faith, something which every culture in every century has found to be more or less necessary. Even in adamantly atheist countries like Russia and China, they substitute nationalism for a fundamentalist religion, teaching people to obey the needs of the state, because in all forms of society, we need some breaks that keep people from just wandering about based on their greed and their emotions. Again, I understand why this is done. We're literally using either religion or nationalism to tame the wild emotions of a chaotic child. Sadly, manipulation by fear becomes the biggest part of it. But as Peck describes, the claims of institutional religion and nationalism fall all apart whenever anyone closely examines them. The third stage of development, Peck calls, or the second stage rather, or third, excuse me, Peck calls skepticism, which can be horrifying to almost all of us. If you've been trained to believe that things happen for a reason, that everything happens for a reason, that there is a God who is in control of the outcomes of life, and that in some afterlife, those who deserve it will be punished, and the well-behaved believers will be rewarded, and then you get to a place where you just don't know anymore. You're just not sure. And probably all of it is hogwash. That, quite frankly, is horrifying. People are scared to let go of belief in something that is apparently just not true. That's really what revivals are for. Catholics invented revivals, but Americans perfected it. A revival is intended to bring a skeptic back into the fold. And that is why religious leaders can be so inflexible, so unbending in their orthodox beliefs. They want people to stop questioning, to stop doubting, to stop being skeptical. And then they try to fit them back into choir robes, give them a role in the handbell choir, and Sunday school lessons followed by really bad hymns and tedious rituals. And somehow that is supposed to be comforting and reassuring. Again, most people don't go back to church. Revivals don't work most of the time because they're never fully convinced. They might be drug along and made to sit in a pew, but most of the time, they never really buy it. Most churchgoers are nominal Christians at best. We all know we don't like any fanatics. We like people to be nominally religious. The goal is to be just religious enough to avoid the potential of hell while not really wasting much of our time and energy on the gamble. Most people either find themselves uncomfortably and largely unconvinced and yet tethered to some traditional religion, or they give up on the project entirely. That tends to be the real choice. The people who are nones, they have no religion, they have no interest in going back, they have no interest in it. What Scott Peck was encouraging, and frankly what has kept me in the church and kept me preaching and writing and teaching, is the hope to see some people make it to this fourth stage, a stage of spirituality that is on the other side of skepticism and doubt, a stage that is defined, and I'm almost hesitant to use the word, but by mystery. And that word itself has been subjected to lots of misuse. But what I'm talking about is a kind of holy wonder and awe at the connectedness of the universe and of people. Peck argues that this fourth stage has seen spiritual leaders arise in all of the world's religions, in Christianity and Buddhism, in Taoism and Islam, in Judaism and Hinduism. When people can come to accept doubt and uncertainty in any doctrine in favor of a more experiential form of community, of loving other people, of striving to be a force for good without fear of punishment or judgment, and without a narcissistic need to exist forever. I have to come to the conclusion that the universe will get along okay without me. Aldous Huxley called mysticism the perennial philosophy because it emerges in all cultures and all centuries among enlightened and liberated thinkers. Sadly, there is a whole spiritual industry that has grown up around the misuse of the word mystery to mean something that simply is devoid of facts or reason. That is the opposite of what I mean. It's the opposite of what Scott Peck and Tillich and Euripides meant. People often reject institutional religion and embrace a set of beliefs that would embarrass Charles Darwin. They embrace a set of beliefs that are more toxic and more stupid than the mental prison that they just left. I am honestly shocked by how gullible most people turn out to be. What I'm talking about is probably better described as having a sense of awe and wonder. What Leander Keck described as allowing your spirit to be astonished by both the sight of an unobscured night sky or peering into a microscope or a telescope, to bathe in wonder that transcends understanding and frees us from fear, guilt, and all forms of self-condemnation, which liberates us to also be forgiving of others, to believe in the potential in even the most despicable of people that they could become a good person, a person of sincere compassion and love. We don't want to use religion the way an addict uses drugs, to escape reality and remove ourselves from others. And yet, that is what institutional religion almost always does. We become spiritual in order to have a more firm grip on reality, not to deny reality. To find spirituality in a deep dive into science and mathematics, into music and art, and into a loving connection to others. We want to help people to overcome the trauma they have suffered at the hands of toxic religion, and that requires some fairly aggressive deconstruction of religious beliefs and flat-out confrontation with priests, bishops, popes, and pastors before we can break open the bars that keep people locked in irrational fear. And we don't want to lose people to the darkness of hopelessness and skepticism. I think we're often guilty of that. When you're engaged in deconstructing traditional religion, when people believe you, they simply fall into the darkness and are never seen again. So more like Plato's allegory of the cave, it's our hope to be dismissive of lies and yet encourage people to endure the initial blinding light of reality so that they can become joyful and a loving part of a profoundly connected universe in which happiness is not only possible, but I think it should be seen as a birthright for everyone. You're not going to live forever, but while you live in joy in the life that you have. Now, this may be just my opinion, but I'll tell you, you're going to find it hard to prove me wrong.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.